Thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance today. The national security strategy says that we've returned to an era of great power competition, which I believe to be true. Threats of terrorism remain serious, but those threats become catastrophic primarily when they're supported by a nation state in one way or another. There are two main great powers in the world. We've talked a lot about two of them already, Russia and China, but I want to turn to a rogue nation that is perhaps the most urgent threat, North Korea, and follow up on some of the conversations we've had today. Director Coates, you said earlier that we're still ascertaining exactly what's happened on the Korean Peninsula in the last few hours between the South Korean delegation that went to Pyongyang and what it means. Is it your understanding that any talks between North Korea on the one hand and South Korea and the United States on the other hand would be talks without any concessions made to North Korea?
My current understanding is that no concessions were, that topic was not.
Part of the problem we have with North Korea and the reason we got to where we are is that in the past 2 or 3 decades, we've consistently granted concessions just to get them to sit down and talk to us?
That is correct.
So it's one thing to sit down and talk with an adversary. We did that with the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War. It's another thing to bribe that adversary to sit down and talk with us.
Talk is cheap.
So we shouldn't play Charlie Brown to their Lucy once again on that football.
There has been a football, and there have been a lot of misses.
Thank you. Some people talk about the possibility of deterring North Korea the way we deterred the Soviet Union. That makes some assumptions about the nature of the North Korean leader and the North Korean regime. I want to reference a report from the New York Times last week that cited the UN panel of experts on North Korea saying that North Korea is suspected of exporting large amounts of material to Syria that could be used to develop chemical weapons and also missiles that could deliver those chemical weapons. Do you care to comment on those reports from last week?
We know in the past that there has been a transfer historically between North Korea and Syria relative to what's currently going on, and we'd have to discuss that in the classified session.
Okay, perhaps we will do that. But that sounds like the kind of thing that North Korea would do, doesn't it, given their history?
Given their history, it sounds like it.
Yeah. And that makes them somewhat different from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, had a nuclear arsenal that could destroy the American way of life, but they rarely transfer that kind of weapons of mass destruction technology to rogue nations like Syria, correct?
I'm not sure I have enough information to say yes or no on that, but that's...
It's
we have some history, that's for sure.
Very risky to transfer nuclear, chemical, or biological technology if you care for the long-term preservation of your regime. But given this economic and diplomatic situation that North Korea faces, I think that makes them somewhat different than the Soviet Union in the Cold War. General Ashley, let's turn to a brief comment you made, I think, in an exchange with Senator Fisher about the indirect fire systems that North Korea has on or near the DMZ. Sometimes the North Korean leadership say they could turn Seoul into a lake of fire? Is that what they call it?
Yeah, I'm not sure of the phrase, but it would be a significant amount of casualties.
Something like that, yeah. You also mentioned that a lot of North Korea's military weapons are Soviet-era systems. Do we know what percentage of those mortar, rocket, and artillery systems in North Korea's arsenal are Soviet-era systems, which means by definition now at this point at least 27 years old?
Yeah, I would say the majority of them are. We can give you an exact breakdown.
Okay. Of that percentage, do we know what percentage of those are very well maintained by the North Korean military?
So my understanding is the level of maintenance is pretty good on the systems. Now, there's going to be a degree of atrophy over time, but our expectation is those systems will work.
And what about the availability of the parts and the ammunition rounds that all of those systems would need?
So that becomes more problematic in terms of amount of ammunition and supply parts for replacements.
Because those are not widely available on
Correct.
the international arms market?
Correct.
And then finally, those systems don't fire themselves. They need well-trained crews to fire them. Do we have an assessment of the training level of the North Korean armies at the crew level and how they can operate all those systems?
So we watched their winter and their training exercises. They've shown a level of discipline and expertise. I don't know that I can take that all the way down to the crew level, But I will go back to the comment I made earlier that Kim Jong-un, far different from his father in the level of rigor that they've applied to their training regime to make sure their crews are ready.
Yeah. So when you pile up all of those estimates on top of each other, though, there is some question about the overall effectiveness of North Korea's indirect fire systems. Probably a little bit less than what the North Korean leader suggested it might be, but still a grave threat to South Korea and to American troops on the peninsula. Is that right?
Still a great threat.
Finally, what's the quality of North Korean air defenses against U.S. aircraft?
So let me take that into a closed session. That's a little more complicated answer.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it, gentlemen.